but I'm increasingly curious about Joe Rogan.
I mean, he's not like particularly bright.
Curiosity will kill the cat.
But like, yeah, he's like if Dave, like you know Dave Rubin.
Yeah.
He's like if Dave Rubin, but like if Dave Rubin wasn't malicious.
Okay.
Just a really
like a bald Dave Rubin.
Yeah, just a really softball interviewer.
Yeah.
If Dave Rubin was being front-ended not by the Ayn Rand Institute and PragerU, but by like Herbalife, that's basically Joe Rogan.
That paints a very clear picture.
Yeah.
Folks, we are here to talk Brexit. What is it?
Dun, dun, dun.
Where is it going? We have questions.
Whenever I'm at Palacio de los Jugos, they always ask, when are you going to do a Brexit episode?
Yeah. And here it is, folks. By popular demand, we're here with a man who has single-handedly corrupted many a Cuban youth into socialism.
I'm blushing.
I stand as evidence.
And Andy, who's here with us.
A corrupted socialist Cuban youth.
Former Turning Point.
Former Turning Point, now revolutionary
now
socialist.
a Marxist-Leninist. Mm-hmm. So we're going to do introductions. I'm Tomas Kennedy.
My name is Andy.
Jerry Doherty.
Ron Cox.
All right. So, getting started, we'll start with the most recent development, and we'll, I guess, kick off from there, which is Boris Johnson is the new Prime Minister of the UK, whose whole pitch is basically like, let's just get this shit over with on October 31st of 2019. If there's no deal, we're out of here. The coverage I've seen has basically been, well, every prediction about Brexit and the aftermath has been wrong so far, so why should we worry about what's going to happen after a hard exit? I personally think more about what the political consequences of Brexit will be rather than the short-term economic consequences, but we'll let you tee off from there.
Yeah, and I do want to add the disclaimer that Gerald has a bit more understanding of this issue, but myself, I don't know about you, Andy, but
I know, like, on the surface stuff.
we are ignorant.
Basic-
But Professor Cox, that's why we invited you, because you are the fountain of knowledge.
The corrupter.
An oasis of knowledge in a desert of ignorance.
Miami
This-
we call him.
The longer the title, the better. Okay, the Brexit issue is seen through the eyes of Boris Johnson. And the quick no-deal Brexit could prove to be very disastrous in terms of its immediate effects. Because we're talking about as many as 3 million workers, a lot of economic forecasters say would be immediately impacted by a quick no-deal Brexit. We're talking about a steady collapse of the British economy, which could be worse than the collapse of the capitalist global economy after 2008. We're talking about a Brexit that's being led politically by a reactionary far-right coalition, which, as Marxist would put it, the petty bourgeois of Britain. If you look at all the studies about the biggest backers of Brexit, it's essentially people who fall in the middle tier of the capitalist economy. The people who are small business owners, the people who feel squeezed by the transnational capitalism, but they're still doing better than other people that they claim are the problem. And of course, the people they claim are the problem are the immigrants who they want to see reduced. Want to see the immigration system tightened in Britain. And I think this is what some leftists misunderstand when they try to say the left should take a pro-Brexit, or what they call a Lexit position. Because essentially the political conditions are not ripe for the left taking a constructive and workable Lexit position. Because all the forces behind Brexit are the worst forces for the working class. They threaten to further divide the working class. And of course, our goal as socialists is to try to unite the working class, and therefore pro-immigration stance is first and foremost.
So actually, I want to back up a little bit though. So I understand, I think everyone here does, that the Brexit campaign has been hijacked by reactionaries and right-wingers, and in some cases fascists, to propagate these horribly divisive, racist, nativist
Like
ideas.
Tony Robinson, that guy.
Yeah, and Nigel Farage and Boris Johnson himself. But can we start by actually talking about the merits of the European Union itself? Because I think there is like a leftist position on getting rid of the EU as it stands currently.
Yes.
I think there's good things to salvage from it, like the freedom of movement aspect, but a lot of the economic aspects of the EU, and the fact that some members of the EU have a lot of power over weaker members or less economically developed members, and also the fact that the political system within the EU is inherently very undemocratic from my perspective, is worth exploring. So I was just wondering what your take is on the merits of the EU itself,
Right.
independent of the Brexit context.
Sure. The left has had a pretty strong critique of European Union. I think the critique has been justified because the EU operates in a very top-down fashion. You essentially have the EU structured around a strong executive, which is unaccountable. You have a parliament that has very little authority. All the power is vested within the EU and the EU Commission, which is not elected. The EU Commission is appointed by European Council of Ministers who represent the various countries. So essentially, who dominates EU politics are the people who can marshal the resources to get close to where policy is made. And that invariably is the executive within the executive structure of the EU, which suffers from severe democracy deficits. In fact, it's fundamentally anti-democratic. You basically have a lot of closed-door processes. You have a parliament that's asked to ratify legislation that they don't get to essentially develop themselves. So essentially you have a democratic structure that is non-existent. You have a parliament that really doesn't function even as a bourgeois parliament. They have less power than parliaments do in nation states within the European Union. So I think a strong left critique of the EU as representing the interest of transnational capital is necessary. I think that's an essential starting point for understanding why people on the left would be attracted to Brexit, because some people on the left equate Brexit with this critique of the European Union. I think they get it half right. I think the European Union is a serious problem. I think it does deserve a strong critique, but then you've got to assess how can we best position ourselves as socialists to engage in a productive critique that will enhance the ability of the working class to move forward.
So then let's fast forward a bit. So considering that, how the fuck did we get here? Like, how was the Brexit, there's long been, right wing and nativist and left factions that have advocated for countries to leave the EU or even reforming the EU, whatever. But how, in Britain especially, how did Britain arrive at the current Brexit moment? And if you can you finish that answer with David Cameron's just self-own?
Right. The destruction and demise of David Cameron is a nice place to.
Which I will say, there's a positive thing about Brexit is watching the Tories and the Conservatives in England just own themselves over and over again. Cameron, Theresa May, literally leaving in tears. So.
Right.
If you fuck a pig, sometimes the pig fucks back.
Indeed, man.
The Conservative Party in Britain has a fundamental contradiction that was evident during the Thatcher period of the 1980s, because you have a section of the Conservative Party that are thoroughly transnational capitalists that support the European Union, that oppose Brexit, voted heavily for the Remain position. But you have a sort of middle tier of the Conservative Party, which consists of the petty bourgeois small business owners that I referenced. These people have always been catered to on the basis of ultranationalism. So to try to keep a broader coalition together, the Conservative Party has tried to appeal to both camps. They found that appealing to the second camp, the petty bourgeois camp, is highly effective in elections. So that has deepened.
So you're saying by doing like racism and pro-nationalism stuff?
Exactly. The racism, the anti-immigration, the xenophobia, all of this sort of plays heavily into a concerted effort to win votes, and to try to swing some working class votes to this position by trying to make workers think that their identity should be with the UK or with Britain or with England at the root of the matter, rather than the European Union. And therefore, this also represents a kind of desire to turn back history and to sort of long for the days of the British Empire,
Right.
when all was right with the world, and Britain controlled, most of the world's population, much of the world's population, with its colonial structure and with its naval power. Those are the days that conservatives like to wax nostalgic about, both because some of them believe it ideologically, but I think it's more cynical than that at the end of the day. I think it's kind of a mirage to build up this bigger coalition and try to distract people from the way that the Conservative Party has been systematically stealing from them, in terms of diverting resources from the poor and working class to the rich.
That kind of brings up a question in my mind. So I think that it's been clear that like throughout the world, and especially like more developed countries, we've seen this sort of like shift towards right-wing politicians sort of talking about, returning to this time of glory. I mean, we saw that here with like Donald Trump, and his whole campaign was basically based on, going around telling people that we can make America how it once was. I mean, to me, there wasn't really an era that America was that great, but we see people in the UK doing that as well. Boris Johnson, and that kind of sounds to me like what happened in Germany with Hitler sort of saying let's make Germany great again, and then Benito Mussolini saying let's restore ourselves to the height of the Roman Empire. Do you think that there's a parallel between that? And if there is, can you tell me, like, do you have any idea as to why that might be happening now? Do you think it's because of America, or? This is,
I think, a twofold phenomenon. I think you pointed your finger on something that is 100% accurate. The first part of the phenomenon is, how do capitalist parties react during periods of fundamental crisis? During periods of depression or extreme recession, capitalist parties that are trying to maintain themselves in power, or emerging parties that represent a sector of the capitalist elite, use appeals to the middle class, use appeals to history and historical greatness, use racism, use xenophobia to try to divide people and to try to divide and conquer the population. Because it's during periods of economic crisis that the capitalist system is faced with fundamental cleavages. And the biggest concern that capitalists have during these periods is to prevent any kind of mobilization against the dominant capitalist parties. The second aspect of this is that fascism is sort of built into modern day neoliberal globalization. And what I mean by that is that capitalists have ransacked the state, have privatized the state, have privatized state assets for a long time, leaving less for the population, taking more for themselves, which has created a crisis in terms of social welfare spending, which has resulted in more spending on police and prisons and the military. These contradictions need to be swept away as far as the capitalist parties are concerned. They don't want to be honest with the population about what's happening. They want to do more of the same. You can get away with more of the same by their calculation if you simply put the blame on those that are most vulnerable and cannot defend themselves.
So you step on their throats more, is what you're saying.
Exactly.
So then, can you go over David Cameron's cell phone though? Because it's fucking hilarious.
I think that needs to be
the David Cameron implosion.
The catalyst of this conversation.
Right. The David Cameron action actually to put a resolution to the public which will allow them to vote to remain in the EU or exit from the EU is one of the greatest miscalculations among political elites, because clearly Cameron was not necessarily looking for the kind of vote he got.
Nope.
And I think this is an embodiment of how self-satisfied the capitalists at the very top of the system, the transnational capitalists with all the money,
And out of touch.
out of touch
Do you
with,
think
with
that's
the
the moment that
population.
they realize that we need to shift over to that, to those xenophobic and more, racialized appeals?
I
Because he
certainly...
does represent that side, right?
Exactly. Well, he represents a conservative party that embodies, all of these sides. And so in terms of the transnational capitalist, they're perfectly happy to veer off in that direction when it suits their interest. But this has been a steady drumbeat when it comes to the sector of capitalists that feel most squeezed by the system. These are the people that have been engaging in racism, homophobia, xenophobia for decades. So basically, the Conservative Party realizes it has a bit of a contradiction here. They still felt at the end of the day that people were going to vote Remain because their pollsters kept telling them that was going to happen. But of course, we know that it's probably not a good idea to listen to pollsters these days because they've been wrong in so many situations.
I can't think of any other.
Yeah, no, I don't remember.
Can you tell us why David? So for the audience, whoever's listening, why David Cameron made that? Why he made that miscalculation?
Well,
what was he trying to do?
He was facing some serious issues within his own Conservative Party. He felt that he needed to appease a block of activists who'd been around since the 1980s, who were pressuring him on the question of the EU. And Cameron felt that he would be able to sort of square the circle, so to speak, by having this vote and coming out of this vote in a better position, because he needed to appeal to this diverse group of conservatives in Parliament to actually get through the legislation that he wanted to get through.
And these conservatives thought that they would get them.
They thought that they would get the vote.
And they did.
They didn't. So it was a miscalculation. Now note that what Cameron was doing in connection with the Conservative Party is he was stripping funding that would be necessary to adequately pay for services to account for increased immigration.
Including the NHS.
Including
the
the
big part of the
NHS.
debate.
That's right. So as you're slashing services, you're drawing the ire of a lot of people, not just middle class people, but some working class people.
Yeah.
So how best to redirect that anger? By trying to say, okay, our options are constrained. It's really the EU that's screwing us,
Right.
not us. It's not the Conservative Party, it's the European Union. So here's where a lot of fallacies, often a wrong-headedness, comes into play in terms of some critiques of the EU. It's perfectly legitimate to critique the EU for lack of democracy, for being a kind of agent for transnational capital and something that the left should take on and try to defeat. All that is perfectly reasonable. However, I've seen left critiques that are inaccurate when it comes to the European Union's social policies, because there's this running critique that seems to suggest if Britain stayed in the EU and let's say Jeremy Corbyn managed to become prime minister, the EU's social charter would prevent Jeremy Corbyn from enacting his transformative agenda. That basically is false.
Yeah, I don't think that's...
Because the EU does not prohibit nationalization. You look at the railways throughout the European Union countries. A lot of railway systems are still thoroughly nationalized at fairly high percentage rates, even though there's been efforts to privatize them. So I think those critiques are wrong-headed. We need to be accurate about this kind of stuff because it has real implications. What is happening instead is that the British conservatives have moved far to the right of even EU policy in some of the things that they've done. So basically, by critiquing the EU, they're setting up a kind of straw man compared to what the EU's actual policy record is, despite the fact that the EU is an awful institution. It practices austerity, it works for the benefit of transnational capital, it imposes stringent terms on the southern European countries for debt adjustment, including terms toward Greece that has served to spiral the Greek economy into a severe depression, long recession. So it certainly has been guilty of all sorts of sins. But it's got plenty of sins that we can talk about. But I think it's important to be very accurate about what it can and cannot do based on EU social policy.
Can we jump off that point to interrogate further the Lexit position and why it is so stupid? Because right now, Corbyn and McDonnell, as far as I can tell, are inching towards backing at least the concept of a second referendum, at least in rhetoric. But their whole, we need a Brexit for the working class stuff was basically hung up on these, like you said, false preconditions of, we need to get out of the EU if we want to renationalize rail and do a lot of the transformative stuff that the EU would force us or prevent us from doing. There's confusion in what is it? It's basically, correct me if I'm wrong, the EU, if you want to be a new member as of 2002, you have to go through a series of quote unquote market liberalizations or whatever. But for existing member states, it wouldn't be an obstacle to that kind of a program. And yet they're basically willing to say, okay, yeah, no more freedom of movement. We'll sign off on that on October 31st if that's what it comes to. Basically, we're not willing to fight for the right of free people to move freely in and out of the UK, basically,
That's
which
right.
is to me a huge mistake.
Terrible.
There seems to be some wistful nostalgia among certain sectors of the left. And I read some of these people in some of the Jacobin articles over the past year, which basically defends a Lexit on the basis of we can build a kind of socialism in one country much better if we leave the EU. But of course, there are two problems with that. The first problem is you should never be thinking in terms of building socialism in one country.
Yeah, the first one is the whole 100
Yeah, did you hear that, everybody? Did you hear
that?
that?
Don't do nationalism.
That's tanky shit.
Very tacky stuff. So that's the first issue. The second issue is basically that the nationalism means that you're essentially falling into the trap that the fascists are setting for you. Mm-hmm. You're basically, instead of talking about class, instead of talking about class unity across borders, you're talking about the ability of your class to extract what you can from your own bourgeoisie, mm-hmm. ignoring the fact that your own bourgeoisie has long been a transnational bourgeoisie that has a lot of options, that doesn't have to necessarily stay in Britain. They've got a lot of things they can do to make the economy scream. At the end of the day, you as a British working class or an English working class, you have to depend on your alliances with the working class and the rest of the European Union. That needs to be so front and center with the Labour Party. I'm glad to finally see they're starting to gradually move in that direction, but it took them far too long for my taste.
So on that note, so let's move on to Theresa May, because it's also hilarious.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
So can you explain, after David Cameron, how Theresa May comes into power, her epic fail after fail.
3 fails. It was fail after fail after fail.
And then just how she got owned and left in literal tears.
Sure. So Theresa May's ambition throughout her political life is to have been the Prime Minister of Britain. Well, she succeeded in that ambition, but things went completely wrong after that, because the one issue she had to confront and would mark either success or failure for her entire Prime Ministership was successfully navigating the Brexit issue. She had a very difficult task here, because she understood intellectually that you can't do what Boris Johnson claims to want to do. You can't just exit and just forget about the details. She tried to be a detailed-oriented person in producing some kind of exit that would still be costly for Britain, but would be less costly than a full-blown, no conditions kind of Brexit. She failed because the Conservatives were firmly aboard the Brexit train at this point. They basically did not want the kind of conditions that May said needed to be attached to Brexit at the end of the day, which basically meant that there would still be a kind of customs union attachment to the EU, there would still be a market attachment to the EU, and not be a complete severing the British economy from the EU. It would be more like a gentle distancing, where you would still have to work out the differences in tariffs and so on, but the extreme disconnect between the contemporary period and the Brexit period would be navigated more smoothly. This would be a kind of moderate position, but the Conservative Party has put itself in the posture of defending Brexit at all cost. And they've attached a political litmus test to each other at this point. Who is stronger on Brexit can appeal more firmly and more strongly to the electorate. So basically, this is an issue that is beyond the scope of complete rationality at this point. The transnational capitalist class would have liked to have seen the Conservative Party adapt to Theresa May's deal. They were in favor of this as opposed to a hard Brexit. But even they didn't have the power to get what they wanted, because the Conservative Party found itself captive to the ideologues who were very close to the small business sector, who'd been agitating since the Thatcher period, to the nationalists. So basically, that has continued to kind of entrap the Conservative Party behind this ideology.
Do you think that that's like do you think it's like characteristic of most conservative and right-wing parties across the world? Because I mean, we saw the same thing here. For some time, it looked like in America the Republican Party was going to turn more towards, the whole Rand Paul type.
Rubio.
Right,
Yeah.
and also like the Rubio, not nationalist, but not so nationalist to the point where we're like cutting off foreign deals. And then we got Trump,
And
right?
we went full fascist.
And then we went full like fascist, full like ethno-nationalist, make America great again type behavior. Do you think that that's characteristic of, do you think that's going to happen in other European countries as well, for example?
It already is in a few of them.
Or can you speak to that if you have knowledge of it?
Over the past 15 to 20 years, under what some have called neoliberal global capitalism, the capitalist state has suffered a severe legitimacy crisis. This can be documented in opinion poll after opinion poll throughout the European Union, in the United States. Country after country, voters express a deep distrust of their own government. They basically say, when asked simple questions, do you trust politicians to represent your interests? People say no. And they say no in much larger numbers than used to be the case. This has pushed conservatives in a direction, because the capitalist state is illegitimate. This has put conservatives in a position of having to defend the capitalist state any way they can. And so, of course, the fallback is nationalism. The fallback is immigrant bashing. The fallback is us versus them, and a kind of mythic appeal to history. This is when fascism has the most likely opportunity to emerge full blown.
So then, can I think that's a perfect segue into the Boris Johnson story. How did this fucking clown become prime minister, and what can we expect? Is he also going to be a failson?
What is it about fascist buffoons who hang out in Manhattan that people seem to think make good heads of state?
Right.
I would say
They have extremely bad hair.
Also, I was gonna ask if you can comment on the political economy of his hairstyle.
I would say I think he is a lot smarter than Trump, obviously, and even that's not a high bar, but even above that bar, I do think he's like playing dumb a lot. Like, or he plays this like sort of stupid, like buffoonish caricature of himself. I don't know if you agree with that, but
he's very self-aware about the way he uses his apparent lack of knowledge, and especially lack of preparation, to his advantage. Because he had a revealing interview not too long ago where he confided in the reporter. And he said, "Look, do you really think it's better for a politician to go into an interview and to actually grasp all the facts and sort of spin everything so cleverly and maybe make a mistake or two in the process? Or do you think it's better for the politician to go out there and sort of deliberately say to the public he may not know X, Y, or Z, and then sort of talk off the top of your head for 10 minutes about nothing?" And he thinks clearly the latter approach is a better approach, because it gets the public more instinctively on his side. And of course, in the area of tabloid journalism, sort of hyper-corporate journalism, where journalists are more attracted to people who can effectively get on social media or use media effectively in terms of give us a quote. That kind of personality can be very effective.
Do you think there's I mean, I hate to be the guy who's always drawing comparisons, but do you see that as
Connecting the dots, bro.
It's obviously similar to like the behavior that Trump exhibits, trying to sort of portray himself as this like what's it called, unfiltered president. I mean, in his candidacy, he basically got on the stage and justified all his his incorrect statements by saying, I'm from not Washington, I'm from not the political class. Do you think it's similar?
That's right. I mean, take a look at the pictures of Boris Johnson when he graduated from this elite institution. His hair was perfectly combed. He looked like a member of the establishment.
And now he has an albatross's nest on his head.
And now he has, and I think that is entirely deliberate.
Yeah.
Or at least most of it's deliberate. I think it's become just sort of part of his caricature.
It's become exaggerated.
Exactly. So, it's hard for me to believe that he's this disheveled simply because it just happens. Yeah, I actually think that's a big part of his act. That's a big part of his theater. That's a big part of the ability to deflect the questions from reporters, including his racist commentary against Muslims, his immigrant bashing, his xenophobia. When reporters tried to question him about this after the most recent sort of viral outburst, he actually came out and offered them cups of tea. And he was disheveled, and he tried to make a joke of it. And the sad part is that because he was so effective at making a joke of it, because the press was so lame, a combination of the two, it sort of worked. They sort of eventually gave up and didn't follow through with their questions.
Yeah, like a Marie Antoinette let them eat cake moment, right? Except it worked out for him.
Right.
So let's run the simulation forward. So it's October 31st. Boris Johnson just sends the shrug emoji to the EU.
I will be crying on that day.
It's a hard exit. What is okay, so now we have had a no-deal Brexit. It's November 1st. You're hanging out with Jeremy Corbyn and Diane Abbott and John McDonnell, the Triforce. What advice are you giving them as far as the political program in a post-Brexit UK in order to take back popular power?
Great question. That sounds like a fantastic group to be a part of. You had me with. Basically, my first piece of advice would be that the Labour Party needs to embrace the broadest definition of class. They need to connect the immigrant working class with the so-called white working class. And to do that, they need to make very clear that it's the Conservative Party that have shredded the social safety net. It's the Conservative Party who have defunded assistance to communities that include immigrant communities. They have to make that critique very explicit. They also have to make a second critique very explicit, that the working class in Britain can't stand by itself. I mean, this is something that's elementary and is not that easy to sell politically right away, but without that kind of program being enunciated, I don't think you can do very much. You've got to explain very clearly to the British people that Brexit is going to be a catastrophe. And in order to fight it, we need to fight against the capitalist class here in Britain and in the EU. You've got to make both critiques. At the end of the day, you can't just simply say the British ruling class. You've got to say the EU ruling class. We have a separate program.
Just to add, let's see the flip side of that. So let's say that, for some reason, Brexit ends up becoming more popular as time goes by. And Jeremy Corbyn is faced with a British populace that he wants to bring into the Labour Party, right? People that he wants to convince that Labour has the correct vision. But at the same time, they want nothing to do with the EU or any sort of international organization. Do you think that turning towards a sort of socialism in one country approach is a good idea, or do you think it's a bad idea?
Yes, I would avoid the socialism in one country stuff.
Yeah, we don't want to do national socialism.
That's right. But let's say we're in that situation,
sure.
and he has to find a way to appeal to them while also respecting the popular will.
Okay, these are really good points because oftentimes governments are in very tight circumstances. They can't really dictate a larger agenda they would like to implement. There are are some things that a Corbyn government could do. That's because the City of London is still vitally important to global finance. In fact, the City of London is arguably still the most important financial center along with New York. So basically a lot of activity is going on here. I think one of the things that Corbyn could start to do is to levy taxes on capital movements, targeting the City of London, targeting the banking establishment.
So attack the international corporations.
Attack the transnational corporations, and to basically make that the sort of policy aspect of the first steps towards socialism.
Gotcha.
So, Gerald, can you hit us with that insanely hot take that you hit us with on that first episode about what will happen to the nation state? And
I'll run you through my simulation, Ron. It's one that I think about.
It's a hot one.
It's a good one. Yes, like Santana and Smooth, it is a hot one.
It is hot.
Okay, so we've not discussed the political consequences of Brexit, which for me and the family that I come from is the potential for another hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, and the potential remilitarization of that border. Every poll that I've seen in Northern Ireland has said if that's what it comes to, because they were a Remain voting bloc, that they would vote to leave the UK and reunify with the Republic. Scotland had their move to, was like 52-48, I think back in 2014 for independence. And now that the pound looks like a less desirable currency to be trading on, even though it might make their exports of sheep, golfing equipment, and deep shame more competitive on the world market, they might very well see the writing on the wall with the UK.
Are you just shitting on the Scottish because you're Irish?
No,
it's a little bit of a nationalism.
The Scottish are our cousins. Yeah, we don't like them, but we respect.
Nobody likes
them. Invite them over for dinner.
Yeah, they come over for Christmas, and that's it. So they vote to have their own independence. So now you have the UK is now half of what it used to be. Corbyn rides in on a wave of panic, basically, declares the UK to be the United Socialist Republics of England and Wales, but wanting to get the old band back together, says to Scotland, we would like to reunify, and Scotland says, fine, but you have to call the whole new country Scotland. Basically, Scotland ends up winning Braveheart by the end. Everything up until...
It's a long game.
Yeah. I think all that is possible right after the Corbyn stuff. But how much do you see... But the real question is, how much do you see Brexit as being... setting up the possibility that Boris Johnson could be the last Prime Minister of the UK as we know it, basically?
Yeah, that's a fantastic scenario.
I have my fingers crossed.
You heard it first here. The first episode of the podcast correctly predicted the closing of the Homestead concentration camp for children, and for the right reasons too.
This is
it's a little bolder, but
this is predicting the collapse of the UK for
and the return of Braveheart. And the return of Braveheart, as we mentioned.
This indicates how the working class should be so much more broadly conceived than simply this narrow pockets of the English white working class, because they no longer represent even a majority of the working class in England, let alone a majority of the working class throughout the UK, which clearly is in favor of a Remain position. Even the Labour Party is in favor of a Remain position by 70% in terms of a poll of its membership. So essentially the notion that you have to sort of cater to this narrow group of petty bourgeois capitalists and narrow sort of white working class people in sectors of England is so misguided for a lot of the reasons you suggested, because there's no support for this in Scotland, there's no support for this in Northern Ireland, but there is a constituency for a stronger internationalism. And I think if Corbyn can tap into that stronger internationalism, the Labour Party would be stronger with it.
So my personal last question is the lessons that this contains for an international socialist project. So you have people like Yanis Varoufakis is trying to put together that DM25 group, basically trying to coordinate like socialist or socialist-leaning political parties in various European states, with mixed results, I'd say, not bearing much fruit right now. It seems like the main complaint is we're not even sure how much we want to be a part of the EU, and we have neoliberal parties within our own country that are doing a mix of austerity policies to us, and that's kind of our main focus right now. On the flip side of that coin, we haven't really talked about him in a while, but it's a name I'd like to bring up as a flip side of that coin. So Steve Bannon was getting interviewed in The Guardian when he was trying to put together a similar project, but for the fascist parties in Europe, and was getting dunked on by like smug liberal types as like, oh, did you not know that like European election laws don't allow you to share polling data or share resources and such? But to me, the fact that he's even being interviewed talking about that project, to me was like he's that far along where he's even thinking about what he wants the New World Order to look like and where it should come from and how he should get there, which is it should be a right-wing internationalism and a fascist internationalism, basically.
I think the right wing has been much more effective at strategy than the left wing has, and this has been an age-old story.
Yeah.
Of course, part of that is they have all the resources. So part of it's the fact that they're close to power. They're very well funded. But that doesn't explain the entire story. I think the left suffers from a strategic deficit, in part due to its own making, because we haven't thought through the importance of building a strong sort of class politics from the grassroots. And classic examples where you reference with Varoufakis' efforts to actually try to work within the EU structure, I think it's incredibly misguided the way that's being carried out, because it's very much a top-down effort. It's like saying, okay, let's throw our weight behind politicians that want to reform the EU from the inside.
Right.
But it isn't about the individual politician. It's about building coalitions at the grassroots, and they don't have any of that. So it's like you're starting at the very top before you've done the hard work from the very bottom. And I think that's what the left has to actually start to strategize about. And one of the ways we do that is to constantly preach the mantra: the working class includes immigrants, it includes non-immigrants, it includes whites, it includes people who are dark-skinned, people who are minorities. It basically has to be an inclusive conception of what will advance our interests as a class. That means doing what Bernie Sanders and Jeremy Corbyn have both done pretty effectively, critiquing the hell out of the top of the policy establishment. Conservatives and the sort of Blairite, folks within the Labour Party who have constantly tried to shift the benefits of the system to the top 1%, to the top 10%. So basically you have to have that kind of critique, and it has to be consistent, it has to be sustained. And you also have to start building alliances. There are international labor movements. There are international EU federations of trade unions. I think that's one place you actually try to start, by sort of having a socialist presence within those structures.
So for lessons that Brexit can teach, and everything you're just saying can teach us here in the United States, two come to mind for me. One is a critique of the people who say, we need to reform the Democratic Party from within, whereas it sounds like your advice is much more, if you want a real working class party, you need to build a working class movement first that has a political consciousness, that has political directives of its own, rather than try to just run candidates that will say the right lines on Twitter and on television. But the other critique, the other lesson I want to ask about is for people who call themselves left in the United States, who aren't necessarily pro-immigration in the way that we are, who basically look at immigrants as, well, they're going to drive down the cost of labor and such. I know that they're not a huge presence, but you do run into them online, and they are pretty annoying. So for lessons that you think that Brexit can teach us, the left here in the United States.
Yeah, I think it's crucial to have a strategy as a democratic socialist organization, to actually have a strategy of building an independent working class political party. That's where we want to be. And I was happy to see at the convention there was a direct recognition of this, this is not your father's DSA, your grandfather's DSA.
Those words echoed in my mind.
we're basically, you had the founders of the DSA, arguing for a much closer relationship to the Democratic Party. In fairness, they were also critics of the party from the left. But I think the encouraging thing about the modern DSA is we're much more open and transparent about our critique of the entire party as an institution, while still being realistic that we're not strong enough right now to simply declare ourselves a political party. It'd be great if we could,
So kind of having both of, what's it called, the best of both worlds?
Exactly, exactly. Because we have to have a realistic assessment of where we are politically.
Right.
So where the balance of class forces is. I respect my comrades who are already doing third-party work. They're some of the best activists on the left. They do very good day in, day out work. But I really think they make a miscalculation by thinking that a third party can be successful at this point in U.S. politics without actually attempting to intervene in contemporary debates within the Democratic Party. If Bernie Sanders had followed the advice of the so-called purity faction of the left and decided never to run as a Democrat,
he wouldn't be where he is.
he wouldn't be where he is, and the DSA would not be where we are.
Nope, that's right.
It's just a fact, and I think people have to sort of own up to that instead of constantly trying to accuse Sanders of selling out if he doesn't eventually break with let's say he loses this time, which I hope doesn't happen, but if he loses this time, there's going to be the same chorus of critiques of Sanders. He needs to break from the Democratic Party. But I think Sanders' assessment was much more careful and strategic. He recognizes the problems of the Democratic Party, but he felt he didn't have any realistic choice but to endorse the Democrat given the consequences of a Trump election. Because we are up against a quasi-fascist, not an outright fascist president.
I think it's fair
here.
to call him a full-on fascist.
Full-on fascist. I really have no strong opinion, fascist, quasi-fascist. The only reason I say quasi-fascist at this point is because the kind of fascism he would like to lead us to is sort of in motion. It has various moving parts. You can identify those parts, but it's not sort of full-blown fascism.
It's under the covers, the sheets, if you will.
Exactly.
I see him as definitely like planting seeds for someone who has a much more ideological
this is a movement
through line. Basically, I think he's just going through it because he has just a bunch of instincts from working as a CEO and just being a narcissist that come off as fascistic. And the fact that people are responding to it the way they are has been horrifying to watch. But I think someone with a much more, that's why I brought up Steve Bannon.
Much more ideological.
Right, someone who has a much more sophisticated political understanding could look at what he's doing and say, I could do what he's doing way better and way more consistently and with more follow through, which would be horrifying, basically.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, well, since we're on the subject of the United States, we do be having an election around the corner.
Again.
We've got two candidates who would like to claim the mantle of leader of the progressive movement running, one being, you said, Bernie Sanders, the other being Elizabeth Warren. Just give us your assessment of those two and what you think the main differences between their candidacies and their theories of change are.
Mm-hmm. This is a fascinating question because when you consider the historical trajectory of these two candidates, I think we start to answer the question pretty directly. Elizabeth Warren was still a Republican, I think, through 1996.
I'm clapping right now. But I don't make that much noise.
So you have a very recent transformation in her politics. It's a transformation to be applauded because Elizabeth Warren is enunciating one of the more powerful critiques from a well-known politician of the corporate agenda and the threat that concentrated corporate power poses to U.S. society. But her solution to that is better capitalism. Is a more managed capitalism. Reformed capitalism. She wants more competition within the system. She wants less concentration of wealth. She wants small businesses to have more of a fighting chance. She wants more regulation on behalf of workers, on behalf of consumers. She wants more protections for workers, more protections for consumers. She's got some very good policy ideas in this regard. She supports worker representation in corporate boardrooms, which I think is fantastic. She supports a kind of mini worker democracy in a way within corporate structures, which I think is among the most radical stuff I've read from a policy standpoint. But she really is a regulator at heart. She's most at home when she's talking about policy with fellow intellectuals. She also is passionate, and she also can convey her passion as a struggling mother, a feminist, coming from a working class family. She has the ability to reach people. So I don't want to make her sound like strictly a policy wonk. She's not. But she doesn't have the mass sort of base appeal that Bernie Sanders has. This is reflected in the opinion polls, because the people who tend to gravitate to Warren are sort of upper
class,
educated, white liberals.
It's the managerial class.
It's the managerial
People
class.
who own True Blood on DVD still.
There you go. There you go.
People who think that True Detective is like deep.
Yeah, people who watched after season 1.
But I think what you're saying, you were headed into a good point. And if we compare that to Sanders' base, if we look at the polling, the people who support Sanders tend to be more multiracial. They tend to be younger.
That's right.
So
that's right, exactly. Sanders clearly has more working class support. It's not always cut and dry on these issues. I saw a poll recently in the New York Times that probably would scare everyone around this table and our immediate friends, that said the second choice of most Sanders supporters is actually Joe Biden, which doesn't make any coherent sense ideologically, but I think it reflects the fact that Sanders support runs very deep across these categories.
It's more broad. I think Elizabeth's and you know what, this is actually something that I saw on I'm not sure if I think it was The Hill, that they released a poll that showed Bernie and Biden in a statistical tie. And one of the pundits was basically talking about this very same thing that we're talking about, the fact that Warren, she does appeal to people who are more upper class, more educated, usually white, whereas, Bernie's appeal is more multiracial. It's, more younger people are in his movement, and more people that are just going to be uplifted by the policies that he's promoting are more likely to support him, whereas Warren is being supported more by people who have that income, who don't necessarily need her policies, but just agree with what she's saying.
Right. So if Elizabeth Warren is about regulation and trying to sort of fine-tune capitalism by going after the big capitalists who control most of the economy and insisting on warfare, competition, and breaking up the big capitalist entities, all those are very good progressive ideas. But contrast that with Sanders, who's much more of a redistributionist. He wants to aggressively tax the people at the top and the upper middle class to give more to the working class and the poor. He also has a vision of change that's much more expansive, that involves getting people mobilized, getting people in the streets, tapping into community-based organizations.
Some people have called him the organizer. He's going to be the organizer-in-chief.
He said that himself.
There you go. The man himself.
He was on MSNBC and he was like, "When I become a president, I will not only be the commander-in-chief, I will be the organizer-in-chief."
Guys, we just had Bernie.
I was like, oh my god. I was like, that. I couldn't believe it. I watched him. I was like, that was so fucking lit.
Yeah, that was really hot.
And that's it was really hot. Yeah. But that's honestly what I first of all I want to say that it's fucking incredible that we have the front runners of the race are both Elizabeth Warren, who is like an amazing politician.
She's awesome.
For the American left, and then on the other side Bernie Sanders, who's also an incredible politician. So I agree. I don't think that the left should be cannibalizing each other right now and attacking each other. There's no positive effect that will result from that, at least at this stage. But I think what excites me the most about Bernie, aside from everything that you've described, is that he is constantly talking about building up a broad mass movement in the United States.
And he's participating in it too.
He's participating in it. He's constantly, working with grassroots organizations.
At union rallies.
Like Flick, for example, the organization that I work for, when he came to Homestead to meet with our members, to meet with directly impacted people, with unions, with
which Elizabeth also did.
Organizations.
She also came to the Homestead Center.
Yeah, absolutely. But that's why they make great candidates. Yeah. But Bernie talks about his campaign slogan, it's not me, us. And he's constantly saying something that I love. which a lot of other candidates and Trump, for example, always says, it's like, I will save you. You know,
I am your voice.
I am your voice. Right. I am gonna be the person who gets it done. And Bernie's like, look, I can't do this alone.
Yeah.
I am a vehicle for these ideas, but when I get to the presidency, I'm not going to be able to do this unless millions of Americans mobilize into the streets and demand it.
That's right.
And that is truly what needs to happen.
Mm-hmm.
That's what Obama failed to realize. You know, he had built this massive movement.
He didn't tap it after he got into
that was actually catalyzed into a structured organization, or Organizing for America, OFA, or Obama for America before that. And then what did they do? As soon as he won the election, read Brian Grimm's We've Got People. They iced it. They put it on ice. They demobilized everybody. They threatened, leaders of nonprofits and organizations and the remaining OFA staff to not go after, the blue dogs of the caucus. Those are the more conservative Democrats, to not push for a public option hard when that was a fight. I mean, they demobilized their whole operation. And
that's right. Not being content, Obama was not just content to critique the left in the United States. He's gone after the left in Britain and elsewhere, going after Corbyn as an extremist, and saying that about a number of folks. Yeah,
friends like these.
And I think of Bernie as if Obama actually not only had left politics, but if Obama actually tapped into his organizing instincts beyond campaigning, which is what Trump is doing, to be honest.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think as organized as they could do it. Thank God.
I think his people just get out on the streets because they're so angry because of the things he's saying.
And he's constantly doing rallies and traveling across the country and supporting candidates. I mean, the campaign never stops at Trump, and we need a president on the left that's going to do that. That's going to
not stop campaigning,
mobilize, not stop campaigning, and not stop organizing.
So 2 things. Different theories of change. One is, Warren is going to do one white paper at a time to try to find an executive order to correct such and such problem. It'll probably get torn up by Tom Cotton if he's the GOP president afterwards. For people who are asserting Bernie represents a different theory of change, how would that actually translate in the I mean, not just the bully pulpit and the camera and the media attention that comes with being president, but also what can the president do once in office to help build these types of movements and these types of demands for social change?
Yeah, great question. I think one of the things the president can do is can take serious action on environmental issues, immigration issues. We've seen that as recently with the very flawed and very corporate, centrist, if not more conservative Obama administration. Despite that, even Obama was able to shift through using the executive office some of the environmental policies in a positive direction, some immigration policies in a positive direction by the last couple of years, even though he had a pretty bad record, an awful record on these things during much of his actual presidency. But the things that he did, he actually accomplished through executive action during the last 2 years of his presidency in particular. So I think when it comes to executive action, you can use executive fiat to introduce environmental changes, tighten environmental regulations, and so on. You can actually also shift resources in very productive ways on immigration. You have just as Trump has tried to militarize and borderize and police and imprison, build up the prison industrial complex, a Sanders administration could try to demobilize that, and you could take some initial steps through executive action. There are some very concrete things you can do, in addition to the fact that by actually working directly with the left of the trade union movement, with community-based organizations, you can get pretty innovative when it comes to criminal justice policy. Basically, we could see a complete reversal of a lot of what Trump has been doing in terms of rewarding local police departments, not holding them to any account for their racist behavior, their tendencies to lock people up without a second thought, because that generates revenue for a particular community.
That's right.
jumping off of Tomas's earlier point, if Bernie wins and he becomes the organizer in chief, he's basically going to be doing not unlike what Trump is doing, which is basically the campaign will never end. He'll still be doing rallies as president. He'll be showing up to strikes as president. He'll be showing up to protests as president, and still filling stadiums full of people as president. It does not take a galaxy brain take for me to imagine a world in which MSNBC covers his presidency and says this is just the left version of Trump, because Trump had rallies during his presidency and Bernie's having rallies during his presidency.
Therefore,
so my question, and my depressing question, at what point does it become clear that the elites just have a contempt for ordinary ass people who get excited and show up to political movements, whether they're for good or for evil? At what point does it become clear that these people are looking at ordinary working class folks with suspicion, if not outright contempt?
Yes, MSNBC is definitely the anti-Bernie Sanders network, no question about it. The vast majority of pundits do not want to see him win the presidency. They certainly don't want to see him get the nomination, so he has a chance to win the presidency. They would prefer anybody else. In fact, I've heard a couple of talking heads at MSNBC saying they might consider voting for Trump if Sanders is nominated, right, which is appalling enough, but reflects a deep corporate sensibility, which is alive and kicking. This, after all, is the same MSNBC that fired Phil Donahue after the Iraq War broke out, who hosted the highest-rated talk show in the entire network. And he was the first to get canned because he was the first to critique the U.S. occupation, which indicates pretty much where they're coming from. And, of course, Rachel Maddow wrote a book called Drift, which is one of the most embarrassing discussions of U.S. foreign policy on record, where she basically said U.S. foreign policy didn't have such a bad track record until Reagan. Basically semi-apologized for the Vietnam War, didn't barely mention the military-industrial complex, said basically reforming the militarization of the United States is simply a matter of giving more power to Congress. So it's a wretched book, but of course it's not surprising that she would be so hawkish when it comes to Russia, that she would be so accusatory when it comes to blaming the left for the fact that Trump won the election, instead of blaming the fact that the Democrats didn't put up a good candidate, which is the reason the Democrats lost the election, because people simply didn't vote. So Sanders can address all those issues because people are going to come out, people are going to mobilize, people are going to vote for him. But once in office, he faces a fundamental challenge. The power of private capital is much deeper and much more strategic than many people on the left assume it to be. So the capital strike that will happen if you have a Sanders presidency is going to be extreme, it's going to be quick, it's going to be well thought out, and it's going to involve a coalition of corporate actors and major corporate institutions like the Business Roundtable. And basically, if Sanders doesn't have a plan to react to this, to stop it before it can cause even more extreme damage, he's going to be in trouble from the very beginning. And the way to deal with this is the same recommendation I gave for Corbyn. You've got to start imposing taxation and controls on finance. You've got to start to make sure that the U.S. government has the resources necessary to implement a program of redistribution. And unlike the modern monetary theorists, I'm sorry to take a shot at these folks, not really.
Yeah, screw them.
But the modern monetary theorists would have us believe that it's simply a matter of printing money.
Yeah.
You can print money for a long time without consequences because government spending is such a powerful effect. The more powerful effect is private sector power, because the private sector accumulation of trillions and trillions of dollars means that they have structural power that actually dwarfs the power of even the biggest states.
Well, yeah, because it's actual. What you're talking about is actual, like what Marx was referencing when he said means of production, like that. What the private sector holds is the actual things that create the economy. The jobs.
Exactly.
By the way, I do want to do a Joe Rogan inspired podcast on MMT.
Hell
Oh,
yeah.
I would love to
Okay,
be a
all
part
right.
of that.
That's gotta be a tell
We
me.
have to ask Bean what his schedule is.
Holy God, yeah.
Where is Bean?
Ron, are you really?
Why is he not on
Are
this
you
one?
willing to do a debate against Bean on MS? You'll destroy him, but it'll be funny. And Bean, if you listen to this, like, don't get offended. Ron will destroy you.
Dog, money's not even real.
Hey, he's not wrong. He's not wrong, bro.
I would listen.
I'm about to get it.
I would listen to that.
Yeah. Anyways, I mean, this is all bullshit because whether you guys like it or not, the Delaney juggernaut will not be
True.
stopped.
Have you guys
the
seen?
juggernaut momentum.
Have you guys seen-
And once he taps Wayne Messam
Oh,
as his VP, you guys are fucking toast.
Let the charisma and the police state just wash over you.
There's a picture of him like going down the slide, and that's kind of when I realized that this election was over. Just that picture alone was just,
Race to the bottom.
just a race to the bottom.
Yeah. It's sending a message to both our allies and our enemies. Just relax.
Yeah.
Everything's fine.
Delaney's got this, and he's hot.
And he's hot. He's very good.
Separate question. So for me, the issue where the Democratic Party has been weakest in its response to Trump is immigration, because we had a homestead center here that was basically a concentration camp, and everyone rightly denounced separating children from their families, but no one is willing to take the extra step and say, except on good days like Julian Castro, coming to America should not be considered a crime. Like, immigrants should not be categorized as criminals. Like, Bernie made some noises about, like, oh, you can't have open borders because then you have people coming from all over the world. You can't have that, which was a very disappointing day. But then at that most recent debate, he did say, like, my number one goal with immigration is to get all of the nations in the hemisphere together and actually solve the deep crises that are happening.
Root causes of migration.
Yes,
That's what
correct.
we constantly talk about it.
Which not even Julian was talking about that. So how do we advance a narrative that immigrants are people and borders are bad, basically?
Come on, Ron.
Yeah.
You gotta know this one. It's easy enough.
Come on, dude. It's simple question.
If you look at the position that immigrants serve in modern day capitalism, they are the workforce. They are the workforce for advanced capitalist countries, because those countries are aging. They have populations that cannot sustain a social safety net by themselves.
Right.
They have to have a group of people coming into the country to be able to have a fighting chance of sustaining Social Security.
I mean, look what's happening in Japan, for example.
Exactly, which is a great case, of what I'm talking
Can we
about.
expand on that just for those who
Yeah.
don't know? Sorry.
Sure.
Yeah.
The Japanese case is rather interesting because historically they've had very exclusionary policies when it comes to immigration. But here you have an aging population that simply cannot be sustained in the existing, rather flimsy Japanese social safety network. Because a lot of the Japanese social safety network actually works through the private market, works through corporate schemes and that kind of thing, which is much harder to sustain because those very corporations are chopping up their workforce into triple or quartile parts to try to exploit and super exploit workers in East Asia, to super exploit workers in Japan who are outside of the sort of permanent benefits category. And so you have a workforce that's subdivided as a strategy on the part of the capitalist class to try to reduce wages, to try to reduce benefits. The only way you can sustain a Japanese government that might push things in a different direction is to actually have an open immigration policy.
Yeah, I mean, and if you take a look at like the whole, I think there's like a sort of choice that comes to these countries who are like in this last stage of what's like in academic fields called the demographic transition model. I think they're like in the last stage, right? They're in that point where there's more people dying than there are being born, and they have an extremely aging population. So you either have to send all the companies overseas so that people in more poor countries can work for those corporations and produce the products that you need at home, or you open your borders.
Well, so it's actually funny you guys bring up the Japanese case, the Japan case, because there's actually they've been doing like tours of, like, the Japanese government has been sending envoys throughout the world to examine like different immigration systems across the world and like sort of bring back like policies from all these places. And there's actually a Japanese minister that came to the Flick offices and spent some time with us talking about immigration. I mean, of course, we're like a really like left organization, so we get our perspective. But they were like particularly interested on guest worker programs and guest worker visas, which are not like they're very controversial, right? I mean, they're not, like I don't think guest worker visas are like inherently bad, but like in the immigration world and in the left world, there's something that like are incredibly controversial and get a lot of pushback because they can be extremely exploitative.
Right. They tend to be the corporate choice.
Yes, and they don't have a lot of labor protections, and they're a corporate choice to basically move bodies for capital purposes temporarily without actually letting people, set roots in a place. So,
in some places like Dubai, they're treated like slaves.
Yeah,
that is those guest workers.
That's
another issue that
can
come up.
Yeah, that is a whole another level though. That's like actual slavery. What's happening in the Emirates and Dubai? Yeah.
But let's not end on slavery.
Full circle.
All right. Astros winning it this year.
Onto the serious
much lighter topic. Yeah, I think the Astros are going to win it this year, unfortunately. My Marlins is going to take a process.
Let's do some predictions.
Okay.
What do we want to predict?
I already gave my prediction about the collapse of the UK, so something other than that.
Maybe around the election.
Okay.
Ron, what do you see happening? When is motherfucking Biden gonna go away? When is he gonna finally get owned fully?
Yeah. That's the big question. Well, I guess we have to look forward to his past track record maybe coming to fruition here at some point, because he's never been successful as a political candidate at this level. He's run for the presidency before and he's always failed. So basically, I'm pretty confident there's going to be a point where his failures simply swallow him up.
He always has a gaffe moment, and every time he's run.
Go to Joe 33033.
Yeah, just make the.
Remind me of that 80s song.
Make the
8675309.
He would have sang that song.
He would have got that. He would have locked that boomer vote.
I think he would have actually gone.
Bernie would have to just go for the youth vote because it would have been over.
He would have gone up in the polls if he sang that song.
If the Biden campaign would have been cool, it would have been like Joe 330.
At least try.
Yeah, just try to make fun of.
I tell you, he brings so many hilarious moments. When you get all these moderates and conservatives on stage together, they're just hysterical. They make the Democratic Party look like the corporate party it is, and they show that the left is still very a small part of this party. But the very fact that you can have one or two or three people actually articulating what previously would have been unmentionable policies, such as Medicare for all, such as decriminalizing immigration, that indicates some of the crevices that have opened up within the party.
Yeah. All right. So predictions.
I would love to say that I think Sanders is just going to swim through it and do really well.
But be honest with us, though.
But
You're taking the field.
I just don't. I guess I would be surprised if Sanders comes out with a nomination. There are just too many players sort of stacked against him. I think it's pretty strategic, once again, with the Democratic National Committee. I think they definitely don't want Sanders any more than they did during 2016. And I think they'll do everything in their power to try to block him. And the Democrats have more tools at their disposal than the Republicans did, because the Democrats have the superdelegates. The Democrats have a structure whereby the elites can actually maneuver against Sanders to deny him the votes that he rightly should be getting.
Yeah. I mean, they did it before.
And they will do it again.
My prediction is that if Sanders does win and Boris Johnson is still in power, Sanders nominates Jerry Adams to be his ambassador to the UK.
Let's get it, America. Let's do this.
At least for my hope and prediction, I hope Bernie wins. But I also think that he's not going to win. I think that like you said, there's too many things that are going against him. I think that the part that's really going to get him is when the media starts coming after him, which is eventually going to happen as it becomes more clear that he's Joe Biden's real opponent. I think it's going to come to a point where he's going to start getting out on the streets and our people are going to be there and we're going to show up. But I don't think it's going to be enough to secure the nomination simply because of the existing party structure that you described, which is extremely undemocratic. And I think it's going to be a repeat of the 2016 election. I think that the Democratic Party is going to nominate somebody who is not a good challenger to Trump's fascism.
Joe Biden.
I think that they're going to nominate Joe Biden or somebody like him, maybe even Kamala, because I don't, honestly, at this point, if Bernie falls, I think Elizabeth Warren falls too. And I think we're headed for 4 more years of disaster, but I don't think he's going to stop fighting. So that's the one reassuring thing, that he's somebody who, after the presidency, win or lose, he's going to be there organizing. So
That's right.
And I think we can win. So let's do this. Let's do this, America. Let's get it. Socialism going.
All right, Tomas is announcing his candidacy for presidency.
Hey.
He just did it.
I'm actually joining the Delaney campaign.
I'm
trying to get paid.
It's one of the two.
Is that a triangulation kind of
Money
thing?
wins
I'm
again.
still voting for Bernie, but I'm trying to get paid, y'all.
Man. Official John Delaney surrogate.
Yeah. I'm just waiting until he nominates Wayne Messam as his VP.
All
Alright, y'all.
All right.
But for real though, let's get it, Bernie.
All right. Let's all collectively get that bread.
Yeah, let's
All right.
get it.
Good night, everyone.
Night.
Good night.